Welcome back, or welcome to another episode of the On Coaching Podcast with Steve Magness. That's me, and John Marcus. So this week we have a special edition. So my new book, The Passion Paradox, is just releasing. So if you haven't bought one or checked it out, please do so. It greatly helps if you do so on launch week and launch day. We have some really cool pre-order items up at our website, passionparadoxbook.com, which will be in the show notes as well. So take advantage of that. So this week we have, as I said, a special episode. We were fortunate to record a conversation with Dave Epstein, myself, and Brad Stolberg, who is my co-author on the book, The Passion Paradox. So John won't be on this. He'll be back next week, but we thought it was such a worthwhile conversation that we'd play it up for you guys here on the podcast and give you guys this special look. Because it's rare that you get someone like Dave Epstein, who's the author of The Sports Gene, one of the best books on sports and performance that you can read. And Dave also has an upcoming book called Range that is released in April. And Dave's one of the most thoughtful guys on sports and performance. He's a former runner at Columbia. So this conversation centers around the ideas in the Passion Paradox, which Dave read and enjoyed, thankfully, but also gets into some aspects of sports performance, and also Dave's book Range, which talks about how athletes need to not specialize when they're young, but instead dabble in a bunch of sports and have this non-specialization, almost a generalization approach, and delay specialization until later. So a lot of juicy topics in here that I think you guys will really enjoy. So again, if you haven't yet, take a look at the new book. Put a lot of work into it. Hope you'll enjoy it. But for the next hour and so, I hope you enjoy this conversation again with myself, Brad Stolberg, and then Dave Epstein. All right, guys. So we're here on a special, I guess we'll call it podcast, with myself, Steve Magness, my co-author of The Passion Paradox, Brad Stolberg, and our esteemed special guest, Dave Epstein, who has a new book called Range coming out soon, which I suggest you guys check out. So welcome, guys. Looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for having me.
So, Dave, what'd you think of the book?
I mean, I enjoyed the book tremendously. Not only, because it sort of jived with some of the things I was writing about, but also, and I think I mentioned this to you when I first was reading it, Brad, that to me, Peak Performance, your last book, I also really enjoyed. But I think it was a different book in the sense that it was sort of taking on some more what I would almost call like concrete performance issues, I guess, where in the Passion Paradox, you guys sort of define a question that I think is inherently really difficult to get one's hands around, which is one of the reasons why it's a service to the reader to have you define it. And is also an issue that's really important to people. Like, how do we balance basically the dark and light sides of intense passion? That's incredibly important to like basically everyone, but also sort of, beyond easy explanation and in some ways beyond the frontier of perfect human knowledge, which means that it's difficult to deal with, but also incredibly important, incredibly interesting, and takes a book for someone to draw from all these different angles and sort of help the reader examine it. And so I sort of felt like the reading of the book was my own, sort of an exercise of going through that myself. So it sort of felt like an interactive read to me in that sense, while I was really kind of assessing my own life while I was reading it.
Oh, that's so great to hear that. That's how it felt for us writing the book in many ways. We certainly, when we started the book, did not have this figured out, and we still we might have it intellectually figured out a bit more, but it doesn't mean we practice it all the time. But we wrote this book because we felt very similarly. We finished Peak Performance pretty early, And Steve and I had gotten together to go through edits, but our editor at the time was backed up on other projects, so he didn't have the edits for us ready. And both of us, first-time authors with a major publishing house, we heard that the first draft was great. We had 10 days in person, and rather than like celebrate or go do fun stuff, we got super restless. And by day 2, we're like, oh, we might as well start on the next book. And granted, this book hadn't even been edited yet. And we weren't sure what topic to address. And on day 3, we kind of turned like the mirror on ourselves and we're like, well, wait a minute, like, why can't we just relax? Why are we so itching, to write the next book? And then we said, well, we're really driven. And Steve got to talking about his running career. And I talked a little bit about my work at McKinsey out of school. And we have this like similar temperament, which is push, 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 go, go, go. And my wife is in the other room, like, send Steve back to Houston. We should go on vacation. And that's when we got to thinking, like, well, this drive and this passion, it's definitely a gift, but can it also be a curse? And is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Steve mentioned, I'm not going to mention your names, but at one point in Steve's life, Steve had a roommate that would kind of work a 9-to-5 job, come home, watch TV, just like very much routine, kind of almost going through the motions. And at first we're like, oh, we wouldn't want to be like that. But then at times we kind of envy that, because wouldn't it be nice to just be content? So that was the genesis of this book, like wrestling with these questions. So I'm glad, it's a long-winded way of saying I'm glad that you felt that you were in the arena wrestling with us.
Well, that's interesting to hear that it developed so organically for you guys and so quickly. As someone who's going to, whose agent told him, just don't let it be 5 years before your next book, and now it's going to have been 6. I applaud you guys on that. But I think it's interesting that it developed so organically that way, because I think, like, we hear, passion is in so many conversations. You can almost watch any sporting event or, go to any conference about performance and you hear people talking about passion. But for the amount of discussion that there is about passion sort of generally, it's kind of remarkably superficial. For the most part, there's almost no even acknowledgement of potential downside and of the need to sort of walk this tightrope that you guys outline in the book, which is interesting because it almost seems sort of obvious once you start thinking about it, right? Like, for sure, there have been times in my own career, and I'm sure everyone's, where they are like more driven by passion and having more professional success, but that doesn't actually mean that they are the happiest or doing the work that's the best fit for them and all those things. So it's interesting, because I think you hit on something that once you start reading it in the Passion Paradox, you're like, gosh, of course we should be thinking about both facets, but we mostly haven't been.
Yeah, it's funny, because like when we got about to, like, researching this topic during that first kind of week that we were together and mulling it over, we had that same kind of thought. It's like, well, why in the world? Like, once we stepped back and had these conversations, like, it was Brad and I in his living room just having these conversations with really no idea or thought that the book was going to be about this, but just, it was interesting. So we were having these conversations on, like, passion and how we couldn't turn it off and why are we so, push, push, push all the time. And it got us thinking, it's like, wait a minute, like, why in the world does the word passion generally have a very positive connotation to it, right? And it got us, like, researching, like, well, was it always this way? Because, like, the only other mention of passion that we're aware of is, like, the biblical one, right? Passion of the Christ. And it's like, well, how did we get from that to this? And I remember distinctly, like, putting the words, like, find your passion or follow your passion in that Google Ngram device that lets you, like, search the, frequency. And it's like, not at all until, like, the 1970s or 80s or something like that. And it just, like, spikes through the roof. And you're just like, whoa, like, what happened? Like, how did we make this switch? So, it's just an interesting kind of journey to go from, again, something that was tied up in suffering at first with Christ, and then, suffering in general to something that is like almost like the ultimate goal, right? Whenever I thought of passion initially, I was like, oh, that's college graduation speech, right? Go find and follow your passion, like do something passionately. And, the longer you think about it, you're like, well, that might not be that good of advice.
That is, and it's also, it's like borderline not even advice in a lot of ways, right? You're sort of like, what does that mean really, even in reality? It's like an unfunded mandate that the government does, like go make yourself better, but like nothing about like, how is that supposed to work or what does it even really mean? And by the way, speaking of that part of the book where you trace some of the history, I mean, I really like it. I've gotten into history quite a bit more than I was in the past couple of years, and find it's always kind of delving into the history of ideas is a really good way to sort of understand cultural change. So like that, I'd be interested to hear you sort of elaborate on that finding a little bit more, even because it's unusual, right? We don't, like, Passion of the Christ is a very well-known phrase, but again, we don't really stop to think about how the meaning of that word has sort of changed and what that has to say about cultural change, right? So I found that history aspect, even though I sort of knew that was an older use of the word passion, I hadn't really stopped to think about it and how much it's changed.
Well, it's interesting, Dave, because like it changed, and then again, it really hasn't. And that's the double-edged sword of passion. Is pasia was the root, and that's Latin, and it's suffering, and that's the suffering of the Christ. And then over time, what we found is that the world gradually evolved from suffering related, particularly to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, to just a more general suffering. But it was still a very negative connotation. And then in around the 1500s, it's shifted towards desire. And eventually Shakespeare used it in a romantic way. So to have the passion for someone, to have the desire for them, perhaps someone that you can't have. So still very closely related to suffering. Mm-hmm. And that's how it's kind of gradually transitioned out of this purely negative suffering to more of a positive love connotation. And then it wasn't until really the 1960s and 70s that it took on a meaning of a more general zeal for something. But what's interesting, and that's why in the book we try to be really particular about tracing the origins of passion, both historically and biologically, because the neurochemicals that are most associated with passion are those that are also associated with addiction, right? And what is addiction if not suffering? So to be really passionate about, let's say a big goal, making the Olympics, that's very different than feeling content. And if you get there, that's great. But if you don't, there can still be a lot of suffering wrapped up in that. So that was really interesting to us.
Yeah, and one more thing, and since I couldn't expand on it in the book, but I'll expand on it now, is I think it's really interesting as some of the history that we left out of the book, and some of those transitions that, again, I'm more of a history buff or fanatic than I think Brad. It was the one subject that I was interested in school growing up, besides running. But the major change. So what was really interesting, the major change from like just suffering of Jesus to suffering of any kind actually happened when, again, for our history buffs, when William the Conqueror, went from Normandy over and conquered what we now call England, right? And that changed it from like suffering of Jesus in this religious context to suffering of any kind, right? So you have this major event that coincides with like a major historical thing. And then what was also interesting, as Brad mentioned, Shakespeare, but like one of the other people to use and I guess change the meaning that we know of in history was Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote the famed Canterbury Tales, and he took it from like this negative suffering of any kind to converting it to an overpowering like feeling of emotion. So it's not only, again, from a interesting, how we got here, but it's really cool to see that like major figures of history played, I think, again, according to our research, a major role in this evolution of the word.
And that William the Conqueror, did William the Conqueror like use it, or was it used to describe, his ambitions?
Yeah. So what happened there is the word changed based on the intermixing of the two languages that occurred because of like him conquering that area.
Steve, for readers, if you've already read the book, you can either hate on me for that not being in there, or thank me, because Steve had like 30 pages worth of history, and I just remember emailing him being like, "Is William the Conqueror? That sounds like my neighbor's cat."
Well, Steve will be happy because William the Conqueror is also mentioned in Range. So
there we go.
Yeah, no, that is though. It's just the whole thing. I think one of the very basic things that, like, since we're talking sort of about definitions and the evolution of the definition of passion, that will happen to anyone who reads the book, or most people, will be sort of stopping to think about what they even think passion means. Not like in the different, dictionary definition or sort of the graduation speech, find your passion. But what does it mean to them? Is it finding something they're obsessed with? Because if that's the case, like, I think we mostly would acknowledge that obsession, pretty much always has a dark side, because that's more toward addiction. Is it something, is it something that they just enjoy doing? And I don't think it's just something that they enjoy doing. So I think it's really, you guys are sort of opening a discussion on something that everyone has an interest in and everyone has some familiarity with, but that we just don't think very hard about very often.
Yeah, and I don't know if you found this, but I think that's almost the way it is for things that are kind of ingrained in us culturally and that we kind of take for granted, right? When things are so familiar, then we just kind of, almost pass them off as being like, oh yeah, passion. Like, I get this. Like in sport, you see the same thing with like mental toughness. It's like, oh yeah, mental toughness. Like, that's important. I know what that is. But like, if you step back and you think about it, you're like, oh, like, actually this is way more nuanced and way more deep. And like, our passing superficial understanding of it doesn't give us much clarity at all. So I think that, it's almost like that to a large degree with a lot of things.
And Steve, so as a coach, like, you coach one of the best college track teams in the country. Did you in the past, or do you now? I mean, do you use passion in like your pep talks or talking to athletes? Does it change anything? Is that a word that would come up in your coaching?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think early on, yeah. I mean, it's almost like, in your head, you think like, oh, we've got to cultivate like this passion, which means that, you gotta, however you define it, like, you gotta be engaged and like have this be a major part of your life and like all that stuff. But more so now, and after reading this book, like, I look at it as almost like more of what is driving you and how is that driving you in a hopefully good or possibly negative way. And I look out more for the things that, we talk about in this book in terms of potential things that could indicate that, like, you're going down this dark side in terms of, like, a motivation style that isn't sustainable, right? So we do, for the longest time, I've had one-on-one conversations with incoming student athletes on, what drives them, and then done like validated questionnaires on like internal versus external motivation just to get an idea. And, more so recently is I look at things like, oh, this person is like heavily externally motivated, or was in a high school program that like had a very demanding coach, which when you have a very demanding coach in high school, you tend to develop a motivation based on like almost like pleasing the coach, like doing what he asks, like it's very external, and being like, oh, this is a little bit of a warning sign of, now that this athlete is in a college environment where he has more freedom and more choices and more control, like that type of motivation might not be sustainable.
Oh, that's really interesting. So you actually like apply it in that way. Because, and I'm going to take in a little tangent here, but one of the other interesting things, I think this relates these sort of light and dark sides of passion and motivation. Some of what you do in the book is you take on some stories, some fairly well-known stories, like Theranos, the business story, and look at the incredible power of this like hotly burning passion and the charisma of it, right? When someone has this incredible passion, I think it's really easy to be drawn to that. Like who isn't drawn to someone who has an incredible passion? But also, some of the stories you tell are that passion just totally run out of control without any type of regulation, without any sort of anchor to any type of values. It like almost becomes its own like self-fueling firestorm that nothing can stop, and all other concerns, like the original purpose of an endeavor basically go out the window, more or less.
Yeah, and we really wanted to focus on that, and it's a big part of the book because I think that it's almost unavoidable if you're a human with human biology. So you start off doing something because you really like that thing. And then suddenly you get good. So in the case of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, like company starts doing well. And if you become more passionate about that external validation and that result than the thing itself, then when the tides change externally, you're going to do anything that you can to reverse course, to feel good. So in the case of Theranos, well, maybe the science isn't going in the direction you want, or your product isn't working as it should. Instead of taking that failure and going back to the drawing board, that's passion about the activity, about development, about entrepreneurship, about science, you have the temptation to lie, cheat, steal. There's an interesting parallel in athletics, which is athletes that, and this in the literature, this is the difference between what's called harmonious passion, which is when you love an activity, and obsessive passion, which is when you love the validation that activity brings. And there's fair amount of literature on athletes that show that those that have obsessive passion are more likely to dope than those that are more harmoniously passionate. And in Elizabeth Holmes, it's really just the business version of doping on a massive scale. And that is where passion becomes so dark. Once your sense of self and identity is tied up in the result of what you're doing, then A, even if you're doing really well, it's never going to be enough. And B, if you're not doing really well, you're going to do anything it takes to get back to that place where you are. And for history buffs, like the Buddha called this suffering. And this is in a different, not connected to the Latin root passio, but the first noble truth of Buddhism is that suffering exists. And the way that the Buddha described suffering was craving for something outside of yourself.
And it's really funny when you start to like think of and talk about this passion and like this negative route, like the Elizabeth Holmes or the athletes doping is at first I remember when we were like, oh, we need like some stories about this, and you're like, oh, we're gonna have to look around, and they just kind of pop up to you. Dave, you actually sent us a nice article of quotes from presidents on President's Day, and Donald Trump had this great quote about like how you need to be super passionate, right? And regardless of your politics, like that ties into this obsessive passion a little bit. And then I remember we were looking at like athletes, like, oh, like we need an example to like highlight this research, and who rates like passion as the number one ingredient for success, but like Alex Rodriguez, who's caught, as you're well aware of, caught doping, and like all these different things. Enron, like one of their core values was something about or about passion and all that stuff, and you're just like, wow, this really kind of pops up pretty frequently.
Yeah,
but not and I think it's important, real quick, to add in that passion's not always just a negative thing. It's just that rather than let it, as you said, Dave, rather than let it be this force that takes on a life of its own, it really has to become a practice, because humans are wired to crave social validation. That's why social media works so well. And you almost have to work against your own hardwiring to protect that from happening. So you get really good at something and people start recognizing you, that is going to feel good. That's how you are wired. So it's a practice to let that feel good and celebrate success, but then come back to the thing itself so that your joy and your passion is always around the activity, not what people think about you're doing the activity.
A couple things you guys just mentioned relate to something I really liked in the book, which was where you wrote about hedonic adaptation, and that kind of idea that, I even to broaden it, to think of like once somebody achieves something they like, you adapt to it so quickly that going backward from that is suddenly seen as horrible, even though you didn't have it or you weren't there very recently, right? I don't know if that's a reasonable summary. But I was thinking about that, not only because, I mentioned this to you, like one of my first job in journalism was as the overnight crime reporter of the New York Daily News, and I would report to these disasters. And one of the interesting aspects of it was you would find that people were totally euphoric if they had escaped with their lives, usually. And they would say, I'll never want anything again. I just want to hug my kids. And of course that goes away, right? You adapt. So you have to find ways to kind of like keep yourself from adapting to every level and becoming unhappy no matter where you are. But also, you mentioned when people decide to cheat. And I've been thinking a lot about because I was reading some research about like insider trading, and the most likely people to do insider trading or to cheat on their taxes are people who go from like a position of basically winning to losing. So even if they're doing better than they were, a while in the past, if they start going from winning to losing, basically, they're very likely to start cheating pretty much. It's as if they adapt so quickly. And that reminds me of like, I love watching like short track speed skating in the Winter Olympics. And whenever there's a big wreck, it's almost always someone, it's never like, it's rarely a person who's like passing too tight. It's the person who's getting past, like moves out and sort of panics and things like that. And so I think there's this sort of, when your identity is really wrapped up in those, this sort of panic at going from a strong position to a weak position, which I totally understand, but also in any long journey, like that's going to happen multiple times. So you kind of have to be equipped to deal with it, I think, without totally crumbling, even if it's not pleasant.
Yeah. I'll take a stab at this. Maybe in a slightly different direction, but like you mentioned that short track speed skating, you see maybe not the cheating end of it, but you can see the same thing if you watch enough track races, especially indoor races, right? And if you watch on the college level, especially an athlete leading a pack, right? And he's like trying to break everybody, he's leading, and then all of a sudden 2 or 3 guys go by him. Like what generally happens is that person who was formerly leading doesn't just like, 2 or 3 guys go by me, I need to latch back on and compete. What generally happens is they just go backwards, right? They just fade, like go from running really strong leading to just fade, even if the pace changes a little bit. And if you watch athletes enough, like you see almost this like panic of like, oh gosh, I've gone from this like winning and running well to like, oh, my whole race is kind of over with. And I think like that's a good demonstration of like seeing that is there's something to this aspect of quickly going from a position of power or strength to a position of weakness or losing that has just this like visceral human reaction that most of us have.
And it's interesting too, because you're both talking about in very acute events, but you zoom out, and that is why obsessive passion is associated with burnout and harmonious passion is not, right? Because if over the course of 5 years you get really used to winning, and that's what makes you tick, and then suddenly you stop winning, well, it's like you've got these 2 options, right? You do whatever it takes to win, which often takes, turns in the direction of cheating, fraud, lying, or you suffer from anxiety, depression, and burnout. So it's a really fragile sense of self when you need to be winning, or you need to be winning externally at a greater rate than you were before, because eventually you're going to lose. And when that happens, if everything falls apart, that's no fun.
And so what would you guys, because I'm sure people will wonder about this, what would you say to people who argue, if you win a bunch and you lose, that's a problem if you had obsessive passion. But hey, at least you were winning, like no room to be like kind of placid or more stoic. Just let the passion burn really brightly while it can, and then, pick up the pieces later, basically. Like, why bother trying to moderate passion in any way?
Well, I would say, I'm a science guy, so I would say like the research is pretty clear that if the passion is associated with the winning or any external result for that matter, you're setting yourself up for really poor health outcomes. And I know it's hard to take the long-term view when you're in the throes of a passion or that inertia is carrying you, but you can't perform well if you're not healthy. And then the other thing that I would say is generally speaking, and it depends on the athlete or the business person or what have you, is if I think about a focus on any external result, even just talking about it, that tends to lead to a tightening, like a feeling of constriction. Sometimes it's excitement, but excitement and anxiety are like very close cousins. So I feel tight and constricted. Whereas when I think of a love for an activity, just doing the thing, that tends to feel much more expansive. Most people, not everyone, but most people perform best from that place of expansiveness. It's really hard to perform well when you're tight. And the more that you're focused on winning, the tighter you get. Even if you're excited about winning, the tighter you get. And I become acutely aware of this in myself, especially with launching a book. There are times when, we get a great publicity hit, or the Amazon sales rank gets into the top 100, you name it. And I catch myself being really excited. But that excited, I feel my jaw get tense, and it feels just very tight. And when I'm tight like that, it's as if my world narrows, and I'm sure that I miss stuff. Whereas if I can somehow let that roll through me and remind myself that, hey, I really like writing. I like having conversations like this. I love my relationship with Steve. None of that is affected by anything that happens externally. I relax into a more open space. Mm. Steve, you can probably take us out of Zen mode and offer something more concrete. That's how we work together.
Yeah, I kind of take the comparison to addiction, right? It's almost like if winning is what matters and that's what's driving you and that's the motivation from it, then it's just like being addicted to something. And that hedonic adaptation that we talked about a little bit there is eventually that high is not going to be enough, right? And we're going to have to keep pushing to get, a new high there. And also there's going to be some point where we stop winning just because that's how life works, whether it's where you grow older in an athletic event, competition gets better, or just the luck of the draw in the business or whatever world, where you can't win anymore.
Right. That's a really good point that Steve's making, because it's not just when you lose. Look at Michael Phelps. I mean, the dude, all he did was win, and he struggled mightily with depression upon his retirement.
Exactly. I mean, that's the thing is there's going to come to that point. And I think that's the point where if winning is the main thing, what it does is, it pushes you to if you're in sports, do drugs to hang on and keep that feeling, and other places try to replace that feeling. And, it might be why you see in certain sports, a decent amount of, athletes who struggle with things like addiction, whether to drugs or painkillers or whatever, post career.
And for sort of outside of the sports realm, this hedonic adaptation, I think, again, a really interesting point you guys talk about in the book. Sort of, I see as a facet of the road to the darker side of passion potentially, and just for a wider audience, you mentioned, I think it was you mentioned with this sort of feedback that you can get online all the time, whether it's likes or whatever it is on Instagram. And I kind of feel like the companies that make this stuff are building the feedback clearly in such a way as to tap into some of our inherent social passions and just to kind of exacerbate them to the most unhealthy level possible, basically.
Yeah, so I think that you hit the nail on the head. I would argue that Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, their goal is to keep our attention on the screen as long as possible. And they've engineered a platform that does it by catering to that social passion. I mean, what is a greater reward than being relevant in the world and liked? But the thing is that like the relevance and the like that you get on the internet, it's not real relevance and like. So it's almost like it's short circuiting our brain. And it's a candy, a sugary relevance and liked versus a nourishing one. So what I tell people that are struggling with like the online passion for the likes or the retweets or the platform, whatever it is like be a celebrity in your local community. Like be a celebrity with your neighbors. Be a celebrity at your coffee shop. And that tends to be a lot more nourishing than chasing whatever it is online. Because that's not real. And yes, like while we evolved as social species to be relevant, we evolved to do it in close connection to our communities. And the internet doesn't provide that. And I think anyone, myself included, that uses those platforms has probably gone through a time when, you know, they tweeted something or they wrote an article and it was doing great and blowing up and you feel really good. And then when that dies down, my experience is you kind of feel gross. It's almost like a bad high. And you go through, at least I shouldn't say you, but I've gone through that enough times where now I've kind of learned that like, this is going to feel gross, so I'm going to ignore it. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense.
You know, Dave, if at that recent conference we were both at, if you weren't busy talking to a guy named Malcolm Gladwell, you would have heard all these answers on the social media panel that I was on.
I was about to say, you know, you work with young people, like you were just talking about this, like tell us what's up.
Well, you know, I'm actually interested. So, I mean, well, I'll tell you my opinion, then I have a question for you, Dave. So I think Brad nailed it, right? And I think if we look at the younger generation, as they're growing up with these things where it's like it's almost normal to get these validations. And, you know, on the panel I was talking with Sue Bird, a great WNBA player and Olympian, made this great point about her younger teammates and how it's changed. As she said, people don't know how to shoot the shit anymore. Right? Mm-hmm. So people don't know how to like converse and like interact in a way because like all their conversation occurs on this social media platform. So I think there's multiple different levels of this. But the way I look at it with my college athletes is that validation's always going to be there and it's only going to grow. And it's easy for us to sit here as old guys and be like, oh, well, just like turn your phone off for a day or like delete your Twitter. And some people will do that, but the large majority won't. So instead, we need to equip them with the skill set to be able to like recognize and deal with this, right? And to like have that ability to like deal with that urge to grab your phone every 5 seconds or at the dinner table or like scroll through and, you know, see how many likes you get all the time. Right. So it's almost like the way I look at it is every generation has some sort of skill that the previous one took for granted. Right. You know, my parents always growing up complained about, you know, my skill set for maybe like cooking or doing the laundry or, you know, fixing my car, which I have no idea how to do anything on my car. Right. And that was like taken for granted during my dad's generation. Right. But I think for this one, it's like those skill sets of like interacting, like, you know, how to get validation somewhere else and all that good stuff. But I'm curious, Dave, going back the 5-6 years or whenever the Sports Gene came out, where you kind of went from this guy who was like a writer to overnight sensation where, you know, Obama's reading your book and calling it one of your favorites. Like what was that like and how did you handle that?
I'm so glad you asked that, Steve. I was thinking the same thing.
You know, it was a weird time because I didn't really expect anybody to read the book. And I think I have, like, sometimes if I say that, someone's like, oh, yeah, whatever. But I think I have a pretty strong claim to that being true because if I had thought that the book was going to take on the life that it did, there is no way I would have been changing jobs right as it came out, away from being a senior writer at Sports Illustrated, which is what I was doing. I'd asked one of my colleagues, how long do I need to deal with this book stuff? And he said about 2 weeks. And so I took 2 weeks off starting the day it was published, and I started at ProPublica 2 weeks later. So instantly I was, being publicly identified more than I had ever been before as a senior writer at Sports Illustrated while I didn't work there anymore. So it was really strange sort of identity-wise, right? And my new job wasn't so interested in that. So I was going and trying to find other sorts of investigative articles and basically left, a more senior position for a less senior one because I thought I could develop my skills more at ProPublica. And so I was kind of, this book was coming out and sort of blowing up in its own way. And meanwhile, I was starting a new job where I was at a lower level and I have to fight my way up. And it was very strange in that way. I was glad, when I wrote the proposal for the book, it bears no resemblance to the final book, because my intuition turned out to be wrong about a lot of stuff once I researched it more. And so I was glad by the end that, because I didn't have such a clean answer for everything, I kind of felt convinced that people wouldn't read it or wouldn't be easy to market. So I was glad to be able to enter the discussion because I thought the discussion should be more balanced and there should be sort of more there for people who wanted to examine it in a more balanced way. But it was also kind of like a little bit of a desperate time, honestly, because I was caught between these two worlds, traveling for a new job, but also getting all these opportunities that were totally unfamiliar to me from the book. And suddenly having this publicly the strongest identity I'd ever had as a sports science writer, and in my own life that, nobody was really paying attention to, having just moved away from that. And so it was really tricky. I would not recommend switching jobs right away when you have a book coming out, especially if one of the jobs is much more obviously related to the book necessarily. So it was I found it to be a really difficult time, honestly.
How I'm going to push you on this even a little bit harder, Dave. How did you handle the sudden fame? And again, fame is relative, right? It's not like you're Maroon 5 or whatever. But as Steve said, you kind of went from a little known or a lesser known science writer, perhaps known very well in very small circles, to suddenly someone with a New York Times bestselling book that the president's tweeting about. Did you get that rush of excitement? And if not, or if you, either way, what did you do to stay humble and curious so that you didn't get kind of sucked into the inertia of the success of the book?
I mean, I'd been at the center of intense news storms before. Like you mentioned, A-Rod. I wrote the story that outed his steroid use, and so I'd been at the around very intense news exposure.
But that's so different than you wrote this book. That's you broke a crazy story. Yeah. This is a brilliant book. Yeah.
I mean, it was different, and it's a good question. I guess I'm always sort of focused on what I'm doing on a daily basis. So, I left what at the time seemed like a prestigious science grad school program to go be an overnight tabloid reporter. And then when I got a full-time job offer at that publication, which was much more well-known, I left for a startup that didn't even exist yet. And then once I settled in there, I left to be from being a real reporter to be a temp fact checker at Sports Illustrated for 6 months. And then once I caught on there, I left that to join another startup. And so I think I have a history of not buying into the name of the place I'm writing for that much and being much more concerned with what I want to learn right now and what I think will improve my skills right now. And maybe a year from now, I'll reevaluate that. And so I don't think I was ever so oriented toward, again, I wouldn't have left as a senior writer position at Sports Illustrated to go down the masthead. And twice I've left publications where I've then gone somewhere where I start having to call someone and introduce the place I'm calling from, and at SI I had a big office over 6th Avenue, and then I went to just open desk and again down the masthead. So I don't think I was ever too really worked up about the specific recognition, or I would have taken different job trajectories, I think.
Yeah.
So I don't really know. I mean, I basically wanted what I really loved about it is I wanted autonomy. I want to be able to work on the stuff that I want to work on, and I was glad that it seemed to grant me eventually in the long view that once I could get through like the travel and getting a foothold in my new job would give me autonomy to take on a project, of my own doing next time around. But I don't know. Some of it's such a blur. But like you also realize that like it's wonderful because people engage with books on a really deep level and share their stories and things like that. But also like I'm the only one like living with my head every day, and that's like the most important thing for me to grapple with, kind of.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned that. I mean, that seems almost exactly what our research bared out for this book, which is that one of the best ways to kind of avoid the trappings of obsessive passion and success is just to get back to the work. Because the more time that, my guess is, if you would have like spent a lot of time just reading reviews and refreshing your Twitter and like, I'm the man, I wrote this book, then your brain's going to adapt to that. And like, that's what your focus is going to be, and you're going to need more of it. Whereas if you kind of quickly acknowledge like, oh, like I kind of feel like the man today and I wrote this book, but tomorrow, like I got to get back to the drawing board because I'm interested in ideas, not the success, then your brain, like, neurons that fire together, wire together. And like, that's what you're practicing. That's how your brain's going to wire. So for people listening, I think Dave gave some really great advice, which is like, yeah, celebrate. And like, there's like success in a capitalist country, like gives you autonomy, and that's important. But like, once you have that autonomy, great, like use it to do the work, not to sit there and gloat about what you've done.
Yeah. And I didn't have a choice because I was trying to catch on to this new job, but that's always been, I got into journalism specifically because I wanted to write about sudden cardiac death in athletes. And I specifically wanted to do it for Sports Illustrated. And once I did that, that sort of got me interested in genetics, and then I wrote the book. But the reason I was leaving Sports Illustrated when the book came out is because with that sort of goal behind me, just doing the next story never really kind of felt like enough, no matter where it was. I cared much more about what I was doing than where it was. But yeah, I don't know. I guess there was a point where, again, I didn't know if anyone was going to read the book. And then there was this review in the Wall Street Journal before it came out, and I was ecstatic about it. And the publisher said, oh, that's great. There were like this many pre-orders after that review. And it was like a much smaller number than I expected, not knowing if any more publicity would come. And so I said, like, don't ever, unless I ask, like, please don't ever tell me again. And I never asked again. And I was sort of glad to have stayed away from some of that because it's totally out of my control. And I know I was going to work as hard as I could at the things that I can work at. And the rest of the stuff, I just, I'm going to put plenty of pressure on myself. So I kind of, if I could, tried to stay away from the other sources of pressure, because I don't need like a fire lit under me by any stretch. So I was glad to kind of stay away from some of that stuff.
That is like a fantastic example of self-awareness on like who you are and like what drives you and like what you need to do. We need to start taking some lessons from you because, that's
why we got to go hiking the day the book comes out. We're recording this a little bit early. And when peak performance, like I'm all about being in the arena and being vulnerable. When peak performance came out, I'm like, okay, like I know that I'm going to get this dopamine rush, but like I at least want to go down to the gym and like do a workout. And we were in the gym for like 2 minutes, and I'm on the treadmill. I'm like, Steve, like look at all the people tweeting about the book. And like next thing I know, I'm falling off the treadmill. And again, like it was a very contracting. Back to what I said earlier, a very contracting experience. Like the world narrowed, and afterwards you feel kind of gross. So yeah, like this time around, Steve, we should take advice from Dave, and we should go on a hike and just talk about ideas and look at the trees.
That's funny. The day that the A-Rod story came out, I went and like before like turning on the TV or anything, like went with my girlfriend and went like walking around Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn because I just like didn't want to. It was a little bit different because I didn't know if I was going to get like drummed out of the industry, depending on like what the reaction was, but definitely like I was like, let's just like go for a walk and not, and it wasn't like Twitter was not as, I wasn't on Twitter at the time and stuff like that, but I think it was better to just go take a breather.
All right. I guess you convinced me. We'll find some hike to do. because that was funny when Peak Performance came out. I still laugh about that on the treadmill. We're not going to use our phones. And then 2 minutes later, it's like on the phone. So.
You know what? The only thing funnier than that is, if we're going to go there, Dave, about that time in the gym together, is we're at a freaking Westin in Boston, and like there are people, doing their Joe Galloway walk-run program, and Steve like freaking whips his shirt off and is running like 4:15 pace 800s on a treadmill. So like Steve's staring at me, laughing at me, looking at my phone, and I'm like, I'm not with him. Looking into the gym like there was this alien. I think like 3 people left. So don't look at me, Steve.
Yeah, that's why we can't be on treadmills, but we were stuck in Boston. So fun times, but this time we'll be outside and not stuck on treadmills. It's interesting because it's like the modern problem is like how do you deal with some of this stuff? And listening to your story, Dave, it kind of really resonates with me a lot because like my mind goes to like, oh, this is awesome. Like just like we talk about in the Passion Paradox, and Niz, you talk about in Range, like you're kind of following your interests, right? But what's really cool about your story is like you seem to have this like incredible ability to just like step away and just be like, all right, I'm going to go from like senior writer at Sports Illustrated down to this, which, takes a lot of confidence, but also takes a lot of like not having the ego to, almost take the hit, right?
I've noticed some of my colleagues get sort of trapped in that though, right? Because like sometimes people would move and they would negotiate. It's like their salary, if they were going from SI to ESPN or whatever, they would have, just like as an example, because that happened a lot, they would, like the salary negotiation would be done, but like then they would be negotiating if they would be going from senior writer to senior writer or senior writer to reporter. And for me, like when I went to ProPublica, I'm like, they can call me like, the help for all I care. Like that just doesn't affect anything you do really, So actually after the A-Rod story came out, I went to ProPublica as an intern. So then I got hired based on that story. I became a staff writer at SI, got out of fact checking, and then went to ProPublica to be an intern. And so, I had a cover story that came out like maybe the week before I went to be an intern on dietary supplements actually. And that next day I was like photocopying stuff for Michael Graybell, who's still a reporter there. And like,
that's a beautiful story. So like you've got this book, the New York Times bestseller, the president is like telling people he's reading, and you're doing photocopies.
But it was awesome. I mean, like I learned so much at that internship, and not to mention that's what led to them, later hiring me and offering to hire me, which of course was like good professionally also. That I had other job offers and stuff, but it was great, and so actually specifically, I remember that I was scanning in stuff that had to do with like money allocations from the stimulus bill. And in doing that, I realized that like a ton of it was going to this like one very lightly populated place in the state of Washington. And that led to this story about, a nuclear facility that was getting all this money for these jobs that were exposing guys to beryllium, and they were getting these horrible diseases. And it was just like awesome, and I'm just much more focused on what am I going to learn from this? And I'll figure out, like the older I've gotten, the less I like do long-term sort of goal setting, because it's just not, I guess I just like pivot, a lot more from like one thing to the next sort of, and I've also like just gotten lucky with it, also, but I just see a lot of people get sort of handcuffed by the titles.
Yeah. So I think for listeners to make a pretty clear takeaway that I think Dave clearly has figured out how to do for himself is let your interests drive you, not the title. Some of my favorite research is this study that shows that once you're above something like $75,000, perhaps adjusted geographically for cost of living, but once you're above a certain income, you don't really need any more money to be happy. So like meet your basic needs for sure. But then once you met those basic needs, like, let your interest be the driver, not some external goal of success, an external title. Because again, like I always come back to this in myself and some of the entrepreneurs that I coach is, if you think about your goal as some title, and you feel like your shoulders kind of like get tense, that's tightness, that's constriction, that's not good. If you just say like, wow, like how do I want to spend my time? What things am I interested in? Again, that's much more expansive. And it's just a healthier way to go about it.
I also think you guys in the book write about like interest in a way that's deeper than sort of the typical advice. Like there's a part in the book where you talk about path dependence, and you know this idea that people sort of get locked into a path because they've started down it. And so I think it's sort of a facet of like the sunk cost fallacy. Like, well, I've started down this road, so I just sort of have to stick with it. Whereas, you know, I think interest, I think like demonstrably, and there's interesting research on this, interest is something that we learn from experiencing and reflecting, not something that we can just purely introspect without having experiences. So I think that's a really neat section of the book that's not just, you know, it's not just this like personality quiz advice of just like sit down, think about what you're interested in and follow it. And that's part of this whole nuancing of superficial advice about passion that I think you guys address and that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, Steve wrote a killer line in that section of the book. I forgot Steve, if this is just like in your head or if you saw some study, but basically like we think that like what we're interested in, we then go pay attention to, but it's actually the opposite. Like what you pay attention to, you become interested in. So like the best advice there is like, be curious, pay attention.
Yeah, totally. And wait, I have a question I want to ask you guys before I forget it. What did you find, you know, like writer to writer and all this? What was the most difficult part of the book to write for you guys? Oh. And by writing, like organize, decide to include, organize, any of those things.
Now you're going to force us to make us think. I don't know, Brad. Does anything come to mind? I'm trying to think of like, you know, Brad and I, being our second book, like going into it, I thought we'd argue over like what to keep and what to get rid of a lot more than we do. But there's only been a handful of sections in each book where we've actually like gone back and forth on like whether to keep it, which is, I don't know, surprising.
But I think. I've got one, Steve. So I think that like it's this general theme, and hopefully we struck a good middle ground. So let me give you some context. So when we started thinking about the actual writing of the book, two things happened. Sebastian Junger's Tribe had kind of come out, and Steve and I had both read it, and then we also saw the movie Whiplash. Mm-hmm. And what both Tribe and Whiplash have in common is there is little to no white space. Like reading Sebastian Junger's book, like every single page, it was like a nonfiction thriller. Mm-hmm. And he's not even like he's telling a story. Yes, it's like a think book, but it read like a thriller. It was very tight. And then that movie Whiplash, same thing. Like there is zero white space in that movie. And we kind of agreed that peak performance told a lot of stories, followed the arc of a more traditional plot line. Right, here's some science, here's some stories, here's a little bit of our opinion. In this book, we wanted to try to get down to key points and what we were pointing at is true as quickly as possible. But I think the tension in this book was Steve being a trained scientist, me not, wanting to include more science, and me wanting to say, like, enough is enough. And that only happened in a few instances. There's one instance in the book that talks about a disorder called HSAM. Steve, what does it stand for? I'm already forgetting.
I forgot off the top of my head.
So I can tell you that I didn't want to include it. Steve did, and it's basically the disorder where a photographic memory. Yeah. And this is in the section of the book about moving on from a passion. And what we talk about there is the importance of like not letting your identity get caught up in anyone's story and owning your story. And people with HSAM, because they have photographic memories, they can't edit their stories. So if you break up with someone, that person that you once loved, like a week later, like, oh, I'm so much better without this person. And then over time, you adjust your story. But if you have HSAM, like you can adjust that story. So if you got your heart broken and it sucked, like, you're always going to remember how much it actually sucked. And we use that as an example of like those individuals, they really struggle with moving on from things because you can't edit the story. So if you don't have HSAM, like you do edit your story. And readers will see there's probably like a 2 or 3 page section on that disorder. And I was of the opinion that, hey, we made our point. We don't need to keep it. Steve was of the opinion, let's keep it. And when we have those disagreements, if we can't resolve them over a few days, finally just leave that up to our editor, and our editor said, "Keep it. It's there."
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, that was a good one, because we did argue back and forth over that a little bit. And I think that's what's the interesting thing about co-authoring a book is, like, we both have our different preferences, and we both have, like, different things we're looking at and looking to get out of a book, right? So when I'm writing, like, I like those scientific explanations, or, like, those details of, like, oh, this is how it works, right? And I think one thing that, like, I remember from Peak Performance is we had these performance practice sections, and actually Brad and I initially didn't want any of that stuff because it's like, this is lame. Like, this doesn't contribute to the story at all. Like, these are just some things to do, right? But our agent was like, no, you need to do this. You need to put these in. And it turns out that, like, people found those really valuable, which is fantastic and great. So I think it's important to remember when you're writing things, like, people get attached to different things. So it's important to not get stuck in your head and be like, oh, this is the worst thing ever, when someone else could find it super valuable.
Yeah, I think that example in particular, for the writing geeks listening, that's like a prime example of the curse of knowledge, which is like, Steve and I have so much knowledge on this topic. Why on earth would we want a summary with some practices at the end of the chapter? Like, we know this stuff like the back of our hand, so we would just assume that would be boring reading for other people.
Right.
But other people haven't spent 2 years researching this topic.
Right.
So actually, like, there's the research, I think it's like 17 times you hear something before you internalize it. So if you're writing for someone else, like, yeah, put those put the practices in over and over again, because that's how you learn. So it's kind of funny. Like, I catch myself, like, never wanting to include those in my books, but then liking when other authors have them in theirs.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I want to ask about a specific section too, because one of my favorite sections of the book, and I was curious if you guys haggled about deciding to include it or not, was where you advise people to keep death at the forefront of their mind, which is really interesting. And I thought a really powerful section. Maybe you can explain a little, and I'd be curious if you haggled over including that or not.
Yeah, so we didn't haggle over including or not, but we haggled over how much to write about it and how much to emphasize it. For the sole reason is it's kind of a depressing, topic to take on.
Exactly. Yeah, totally.
Right? I mean, I remember going back and forth with Brad several times on, like, well, let's take this detail out, or let's shorten this up, or expand this, because it was easy to, like, get this, like, depressed, almost, like, emotional feel while we're reading it, and knowing that someone reading it for the first time might feel this to the nth degree. So, but we both felt pretty strongly that it was a powerful thing, right? And I think what brought this to mind to both of us is, I think sometime around this time, maybe a little before we wrote the book, we both read the book When Breath Becomes Air, which is a powerful book about dying. And it moved both of us to such a degree and made us, kind of have that perspective shift that we were like, no, it's one of the tools that you can use and that is incredibly valuable. Yeah,
to keep perspective, and I think, Steve, I told you a little bit about this, and it immediately reminded me, because I minored in astronomy, and partly because I was reading when I was younger some of Carl Sagan's writing, and just found him to be a fascinating guy. And one of the things that it reminded me of in a biography I read of him was that he had some sort of condition where, like, his esophagus would constrict or something. I can't remember the name of it, but he would, like, every once in a while come very close to choking on something he was eating because of that. And in the biography, it's kind of cast as this thing that's always hanging over him, where he has all this stuff he wants to do and all this stuff he's curious about and wants to learn. And he's constantly like, this thing could get me anytime. So I need to get on this stuff I want to do and learn. And one of the things he wanted to promote was a search for extraterrestrial life. I don't know if it's well known or not, but he wrote the movie Contact also. And he works really hard to get funding for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. SETI, which set up these huge radio telescopes, and we listen for radio signals. And after all this work he did to lobby for it and get it funded, there's like this grand opening and everything, and he's the first person they allow to like sit down and put the headphones on and like listen to the radio signal. And he goes and does that, for like 2 minutes and like leaves and never comes back. Because like he wanted the project going, and he wanted to know the answers, but that's not how he wanted to spend his time. And so I just thought he was kind of a fascinating guy who clearly had this remembering his mortality really hanging over him in this very visceral way, and decided, to spend his time pursuing the things he was really curious about, even when that sort of looked a little gauche, like him, not putting in sort of the work on the ground in a project that he got funded.
Yeah, it's a powerful thing that memento mori, right? As you wrote in an email to us, like just reflecting on like there's limited time here. I think initially we talked about stoic visualization, and we ended up replacing parts of that with the Buddhist practice of the 5 remembrances on death and dying. Mm-hmm. And that call was made again, similar to what Steve said, that like we didn't want it to take on too much of a negative tone, because it's actually meant to be more empowering, which is like, hey, you've got this one life, go use it. Mm-hmm. So we also didn't want to be like so prescriptive on like, this is the thing to do. Yeah. Because for some people, like stoic negative visualization, that can just put you in a really bad mood. And if that's the case, then like, don't do it. Or maybe you need to do it with the help of a therapist. I don't know. So we went a little bit broader. I know my practice is trying to read like at least one memoir about death and dying every year. Mm-hmm. And I come out of those memoirs and I'm just like so focused in what matters becomes so clear. So like there's Atul Gawande's Being Mortal, When Breath Becomes Air. Nina Riggs wrote a beautiful book called The Bright Hour. I read books like that and I'm just like, okay, like as I said, things just become clear.
Yeah, no, and I love that part of the book because, again, it sounds like a downer to talk about, but it's part of life, right? It's a part of life that we typically, I think, try to move away from our view to the extent possible. But it's an important part of life, and there's an empowering aspect to it, right? Like, and I think you guys, I'm just glad that you guys touched on that. That was a very powerful part of the book, and a useful reminder. So, like, again, I felt like a lot of the book was sort of doing the exercise. Like it wasn't a book where I like read it and then went and did the stuff. It was like reading the book was in many cases doing the stuff. Like thinking about the things I was supposed to think about. And so I found it to be like very useful in that way, because it was like the act of reading the book engaged me in a lot of the habits of mind that the book was telling me were important.
Oh man, thanks. It's wonderful to hear.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Dave. I mean, it's like, you never know how a book will be taken or read or utilized or whatever until you start to get the feedback. So coming from someone like yourself, who I know is well versed in all this stuff, that means a lot.
And we still never know, right? I always think actually one thing that's helpful with perspective is like every once in a while I'll read a writer, most recently this woman Rachel Ingalls, who like is a genius, and say, gosh, they're a genius and they haven't gotten their due. Some of this is just luck. And I think that's sometimes helpful for a perspective too.
So Dave, before we wrap up, I want to know what like one or two things in that reading process you're kind of grappling with it and going through the exercise. Did anything come about that you're doing differently now, or that you're doubling down on?
Brad, can you say that again? You broke up a little bit where you were saying that. I heard you say doubling down on, but I missed a little bit before.
In that reading process, where you're grappling with these ideas, is there anything that you're now doing different as a result, or that you're doubling down on that you'd already been doing?
Dude, I'm totally sorry.
I got it. I'll translate. Sorry, Brad's mic is breaking up. I think what Brad was saying is that through the reading process of the book, is there anything that stuck out as something that you're doing differently or maybe doubling down on that you took away?
Yeah, I think, one of the reasons I like that section about mortality is because that is a kind of thinking that I'm somewhat inclined to, but had kind of gotten away from. and I think it reminded me of that. Also, the path dependency, where you wrote about path dependency, and like frequently I'm somewhat down a path and feel like it's funneling me in a clear direction, but maybe that's not actually the direction I most want to go. And so it just kind of prompted me to take stock of, of those steps and sort of where I'm headed and think about if it's where I want to go. But more than anything, I think the judging, there's some things, honestly, I have some goals for skills I want to develop that don't have much to do with anything that I've been doing. And I think that
can you give a preview of one of those?
I mean, for example, one would be like fiction writing. And that's something where I'm not comfortable and, I'm not established. And so I have to be willing to go from doing things that I know I have some competence at to doing things I don't know if I have any competence at. And I think that there was a part of the book that talks about judging yourself against yourself, as opposed to sort of looking around at what all these other people have and where they are and how they've gotten to where they are and those things. And I think that's just something that's very in the forefront of my mind right now as I'm wanting to develop some skills that I haven't developed very well, that in many ways would feel like, why the heck would you go and do that instead of going down this like more fruitful path that's pretty clear for you. So that, and also the perspective taking. There was even a part of the book where I think you wrote like reading this and thinking about this helps you take get perspective. And so that, but definitely the judging yourself against yourself. I think is actually really important, but also really rare and not so easy. And that's just very forefront of my mind right now as I'm thinking about doing something that objectively, like maybe looks a little dumb, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's like freeing, right? I think, tying this up, maybe like it's easy to get in that path dependency where we don't do things that are outside of our competencies, right? I mean, yeah. I remember when Brad and I first started working on peak performance, like I would say the gap between both of our strengths and weaknesses was much greater. Like Brad was a much better writer than I was at the time. And like I was probably more in the weeds on science than Brad was at the time. So it was easy to like feel almost like inferior or like not like have the confidence to have like this sort of competency by you. So it's like that kind of stuff can hold you back and keep you stuck in that path. And I think that's what happens to a lot of people who maybe don't have your ability, Dave, to jump around to different jobs without having that fear of taking that leap.
Yeah, and one other thing that actually, I know I'm picking a couple things here, and Brad, you asked for one, but hopefully that's a testament to that stuff stuck with me from the book. But I got like super into Duke Ellington a couple years ago, and he has.
Yeah, I love that part of your book, by the way. And I started listening to him as a result.
Thanks. I can recommend some cool stuff to show his range, because I think the stuff that's the most innovative and creative is not the stuff he's very well known for, interestingly. But he has this quote I love where he said, I don't need time, I need a deadline, because he was known for like he could have a commission for months and until someone was like, yeah, the show's on tonight, that's like when he'd start composing it, stuff like that. And I'm totally not like that. Like I don't need that extra pressure. Like I'll put it on myself. And there was a part of the book, I think like sort of maybe midway or maybe probably earlier than that, where you talk about strategies, like pretty concrete strategies for relieving pressure in different scenarios, whether that's how you experiment with some new interest from your job or other ways. And as I think about having another book coming out, and not knowing how it'll go, I don't have a problem with feeling enough pressure, right? The problem will be relieving some of the pressure. And so I marked up some of those parts of the book just because I planned, like maybe when my book's coming out, to sort of go back to that and look over that part again. So I think that's an area where I took some practical stuff that I'm planning on rereading when my own book is coming out.
Awesome. No, that's really cool. So we've been going on for an hour and change now, so we don't want to keep you too long, Dave. But I mean, this has been a really fun and interesting conversation. It's just cool to hear, again, from someone who's has such a diverse interest and has written such interesting things, including your next book, which is fascinating. To just kind of hear what you took away from the passion paradox, because it's, as I said, like, you never know until the baby comes what it's going to be like. So appreciate you taking the time, Dave.
My pleasure. And I think people should know it's like a very interactive book. Like, I think you're meant to think while you're going through it. And there's a lot of thought prompts, and that I like that, because then the thinking and the discussions continue after you close the book. So that's the kind of thing I enjoy.
Thanks so much, Dave. We appreciate the kind words and appreciate you taking the time to keep the conversation going in this form.
Anytime. And I'm not sure if we're still recording or not, but I'm happy to help,